Before we dive in, this episode is part 3 of Building Solo, 4 Indian women who rewrote the rules, a 4-part series celebrating the rebels, the risk takers, and the women who refused to wait for permission.
The first thing that I realized was the moment my positional power was gone, my phone stopped ringing, right? Now, to me, in the beginning, it was a little strange because when you're in a high pressure job for about 15 years, you just want your phone to stop. The kind of work that I do, especially, what happens is that it does not prepare you for the kind of emotional labor that goes in, both from the point of view of putting together the content, putting together the proposal, thinking about, how this journey should be for the organization, because it can't be the same for everybody, right? It's a very real feeling where you have to kind of, you have to do something which possibly, especially in the beginning when I started the journey, I did not have the experience of having done this myself. I used to get things done through others, but strategically I would be, do the thinking there.
You just heard a glimpse into Roopa Badrinath's journey from navigating a long corporate career to building a practice focused on helping underrepresented voices step into their own power. In this episode, we go deeper into what it really takes to create meaningful behavioral change, why transformation doesn't happen on anyone's deadline, and how she built a brand rooted in healing, intentionality, and identity. We also talk about pricing confidence, the reality of dealing with procurement, and how she reframed that process in a way most solopreneurs never think to. This is Unfiltered Solopreneur. I'm Nikhil. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Unfiltered Solopreneur. I'm your host, Nikhil Vaish, founder and CEO of Boost Solo. My next guest spent 15 years as a chief talent officer in advertising, only to discover that the moment your positional power disappears, so does everyone else, which is exactly why she started Tumeric Consulting to help women build the kind of power that can't be stripped away by a job title. Roopa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me here, Nikhil. It's wonderful to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So you spent 30 years in the corporate world, much of it in leadership roles. And you mentioned to me the restlessness that you were feeling coinciding with the disconnect with new leadership. So walk me through how those two things collided. Was it the restlessness that made the leadership conflict unbearable, or did the conflict force you to confront the restlessness?
I think it was more to do with the restlessness. It's about the fact that, I'd been doing the same role for about 15 years. I'd been the CHRO for 2 large multinational advertising agencies for almost 15 years. And I'd done it all, been there, seen it all. And I was like, what next? What is it that I haven't done till now, right? I needed something to challenge myself. And that's when it kind of really felt right for me at that point of time to move forward and follow my North Star. That's how it all happened.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I relate to that because that's one of the reasons I left the corporate world too, is I felt like my learning curve was going the wrong way. And at some point it's too comfortable and you don't feel challenged anymore, right? And you want to push yourself out of your comfort zone. So I want to touch on your North Star. You said DEI became your North Star, but I want to dig into that a little bit. You entered corporate at a time when there were very few women and you witnessed this pipeline problem firsthand, right? Women at the entry level, but single digits at the senior level, which is still a problem today, right? So how much of this decision to focus on women's leadership was about your own journey and the barriers you had to navigate, even though I think you said there weren't that many, right, for you?
Yeah. Actually, Nikhil, luckily for me, I don't think I really faced as many barriers as a lot of other women would have. I kind of worked in organizations where the gender balance was not all that bad. right? And I also had bosses who really did not indulge in stereotypes, right? It was only much later when I started growing, that is when I started noticing the difference, right? When you are at a low, up to the mid management level, you really don't see the difference. It's only after that when you start growing and you start looking around and you find that there aren't too many people like you there, right? Because what has happened is that it's all about now, the gender imbalance begins there. And as I start, and when I even came onto the board of an organization, I was realized I was the only woman there, right? And all the others were men there on the board of the company. So that is when, it struck me that this is real, right? This problem is real. And if there is something that I could do about it by actually honing into my own experience throughout my career, my long career, I think I would be doing a lot of favor to the young women who are kind of entering any industry for that matter.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that when I was in, and I'm thinking back as you're talking, when I was in Lintas in the 90s, there were a lot of women, there were a lot of senior women. And I don't know what happened, whether that was just a point in time or because today there aren't though. And something has changed, right? And our industry used to be one of the few industries that there were women, but today I don't see that anymore.
Yeah. I personally feel, Nikhil, that was because what used to happen is that in the good old days, the ad agencies would also have the media planning and buying function along with the core agency. And media planning and buying has historically kind of attracted more women, right? So that possibly could have played a role in making us believe that there are more women in the agencies. The moment that moved away and they all moved out into independent agencies as the media agencies, all the women walked out, right? So then you had fewer women in the agency. The core functions of creative and account planning and strategic planning possibly did not actually have as many women as we would have loved to have. That's my reading out of this.
You're right. No, you're probably right, because as you say that, there weren't any female CEOs, there weren't any chief creative officers that were women, and chief strategy officers too, right? Were few and far between.
True.
So the other thing I loved was how honest you were about the fact that your phone stopped ringing the moment your positional power was gone. So take me back to those first few months. What was the hardest part of sitting in that silence?
Yeah, I guess, the first thing that I realized was the moment my positional power was gone, my phone stopped ringing, right? Now, to me, in the beginning, it was a little strange because when you're in a high pressure job for about 15 years, you just want your phone to stop, right? That is the way it was. And now suddenly when the phone stopped, it was not easy for me to get used to that silence. It was almost as if you're having some kind of a withdrawal scenario going on in your body. It's like, why isn't the phone ringing? And you keep looking at your phone very often to see if you missed some calls. And then you suddenly realize that, hey, you know what? Nobody has actually called you, right? And that's when you realize that it's actually a world that we live in where it is all about the position that you have and it is not about the people, right? That's a reality that kind of sunk in, and that was very sobering for me. That was very, very sobering for me because I possibly did not have time in my long career to even pause for a minute to think about these things, right? So that was actually, I think it also made me a lot more humble. It really humbled me, that experience in the beginning of not having my phone ring the way it was ringing incessantly, and people calling me up to solve their problems, people calling me up for some crisis that had happened, or somebody wanting some strategic point of view about something. All that stopped, right? So as I said, it was very sobering.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went through a similar thing when I left Ogilvy. I mean, like you said, there were so many people who were like constantly wanting to meet you, take you out, buy you a drink, this, that. And once you leave, it's almost like, and you always, you sort of false belief that, you're defined by your title also. which,
Absolutely.
it's hard initially, but I think ultimately it's liberating to know you're not defined by a job title, all right? You're
Yeah,
much more
yeah,
than the
yeah,
sum of the parts of the
absolutely.
title.
Yeah, yeah. You realize that.
Yeah. So let me ask. Yeah, exactly. But it's a good, and as a solopreneur, I think there's lots of other things you have to grow a thick skin about, but we'll get into that too. So let me ask you, what part of your corporate identity did you mourn losing, and what part were you sort of happy to shed?
I guess, honestly, if I have to touch my heart and be very honest with you, it is the positional power, which gave me a lot of access to a lot of things, right? I mean, when you're working in a
Right.
large company with a lot of support systems behind you, you have access to a whole lot of, intelligence, which comes in the form of reports and things like that, which is very easily available to you, right? Now, the moment that's
Yeah.
a part that I really honestly I missed, and then maybe I possibly mourned for some time, right? The fact that I didn't have access to that. The thing that I really loved about being on my own was the fact that I didn't have to now stick to any 9 to 5 kind of a schedule, right? I could
Yeah.
be my own
Yeah.
boss. I could decide when I wanted to start and when I wanted to end the day. And I could decide who I wanted to work with and who I did not want to work with. I think that was very liberating. That part of it was very liberating, that I was not going to be, held down by those kind of constraints. That was very liberating, honestly.
Yeah, the power to say no was one of the most joyful things I
Absolutely.
experienced, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
absolutely.
your hands are tied in the corporate
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah. So
True.
you also mentioned to me you started out thinking you'd work on the entire DEI space, right? And then
Yeah,
you started to narrow down. So take me through that sort of messy middle, if you like. What is the
yeah,
process of elimination? How did you start to narrow
yeah,
down to this one thing? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, in fact, Nikhil, when I started, I kind of possibly was a little too idealistic, right? And I kind of wanted to make sure that I was making a difference in the entire space of inclusion, entire space of diversity, equity, inclusion. And, I said to myself, there are so many people who are underrepresented, who are marginalized, and everybody needs help. So everybody needs their voice to be kind of amplified. So I kind of, started doing a lot of work in multiple spaces in the beginning. Okay.
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, I kind of asked myself that, are you kind of really very happy doing all of these multiple things without actually trying to channelize in an area where you have the lived experience, right?
Yeah.
So I said, you know what, I have the lived experience of being a woman in a world where there is a lot of challenges that are thrown at us. So I think I possibly will be able to tell my story the best with my lived experience, and I will possibly be able to help women who possibly are struggling better than me trying to look at multiple facets of diversity and multiple facets of inclusion. While inclusion is the same, the philosophy is the same across identities, I somewhere realized I think that's what I wanted to do. So after having tried multiple things, I finally decided that this is where I want to be, and this is where my story can be told better. And also, I can help women whose stories have to be told.
Yeah,
That's
and
the way I
that's
did.
yeah, no, and it's a very common trap and easy to fall into, right? As a solopreneur, you kind of feel like
Yeah,
you need to spread your net wide
yeah,
in order to
yeah,
catch some fish, when the
yeah,
opposite is actually true. You need to be
yeah,
narrow and focused, right? Okay. No, I was saying there's nothing wrong with experimenting, but you kind of have to figure out where your strengths lie, right? And the other
yeah,
thing I think
absolutely.
mistake people make is they think they need to find new skills, like learn new things and but rather than lean on your experience and your strengths, you go out
Yeah,
and try to add more tools to your arsenal, which is also not,
yeah,
perhaps the best way to go. But it's sort of,
true.
I see a lot of, I made this mistake too, thinking you got to add this, add that, and then realize my strength is everything that I've, the expertise that I've built over X number of years.
Yeah,
So I want to talk a little bit about brand building. Now, you mentioned being very intentional about your naming your company Tumeric, right? With its
yeah,
healing properties metaphor.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, similar to how you sort of narrowed down, before you got to that brand story, which I think is a very powerful one, what were some of the earlier attempts at positioning yourself?
I guess maybe the fact that I worked in an ad agency, I mean, two ad agencies for 15 years. I think what happened is that
Yeah,
willy-nilly, the moment I started thinking of being on my own, I was very sure from the beginning that I am going to do this the right way, right? I'm going to make sure that
yeah,
I'm going to, look at why do I exist? What am I going to do? Who is going to be the people that I'm going to be targeting? And what is the difference that I want to be making? I was kind of very clear about those things even before I approached somebody to help me with the identity design, right? So that way, to that
right.
extent, I don't think I had any kind of any kind of issue going on in terms of how I do it. I was very clear. I was very clear.
Yeah,
Yeah. So once I was very
go ahead.
clear that, this is the route that I want to take, then I was also like,
Hmm.
I need to reach out to somebody else who is also a solopreneur now, right? So I kind of reached out to a girl who is a solopreneur who's doing a fabulous job in the space of identity design, and I reached out to her and I gave her the brief, and she was super delighted to come on board and work with me on that. So that's how it all happened.
And you were very intentional about that, right? Talk to me a little bit about that,
Yeah.
about wanting to
So
find.
So in my case, what happened is that I was, I was telling myself that the name has to be representative of who I am as a person and what I intend to do. That was very clear in my mind.
Yeah.
So once that clarity came in, what happened is that I kind of thought of multiple names and multiple, you start doing things like mix and match, and you're working around all of those things, and and also turmeric is my favorite color too. So it just so happened that I said, hey, you know what, turmeric is a name which kind of resonates with you as a person, and it has also got certain healing and inflammatory properties in it, which is kind of very close to the work that you're doing, because when you're talking about people who have been underrepresented for decades, and if you're kind of bringing them the
Hmm.
periphery to the center, not even to the center, as you start moving them to the center, there is a lot of there has to be a lot of equanimity from their side. There has to be a lot of healing that has to happen for them before they actually come to the center, right? So I felt that
Yeah.
in this journey that they're going to have as underrepresented people, to move into the mainstream and have their voices heard, that healing has to be done by turmeric consulting, by having partnerships with the clients that I work with. That's the way I was really thinking of it, Nikhil, at that point of time.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And has it resonated with clients? That
Oh yes, in
the
fact,
need behind it? Yeah.
yeah, in fact, what has happened? That's ended up being a great conversation starter, right?
Right.
So the moment I get clients onto calls, and the first question they ask me is, "Tell me something about turmeric. Why did you call it turmeric?" So it
Yeah.
begins from there. It's become, without me actually intending to, it has ended up becoming a conversation starter.
That's great. I love that. And
Yeah,
and so let me ask you about the flip side though, because we both come from a brand building background,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
in this case, you're selling transformation and healing, right? Which
yeah,
are inherently intangible. So
yeah.
how do you sort of deal with the fact that clients are looking for hard metrics and ROI? How do you handle that conversation?
I think that is something which is, in my mind, honestly, what happens is that when you're looking at numbers like revenues, and you're looking at your top line, bottom line, and all of that, that's great to have metrics there. Okay, but
Yeah.
here we are talking about behavioral change, right? When you're talking about
Hmm.
behavioral change, you can't expect miracles overnight. it takes time. It's
Right.
years of hardwired behaviors have to be changed now, right? So it is going to take time. So it is going to be incremental changes that are going to happen. And once the clients realize that, the fact that there is going to be incremental changes that they're going to see, and it's going to be a long journey. It's a journey that they need to be committed to. Right? So once they realize that, the two things that are going to happen here, then I think they're kind of pretty much on board. They're not really saying that, hey, you know what, if people attend this program that you conduct, let us say, can I expect them from tomorrow morning to have kind of, becoming something totally different? No, it doesn't happen so fast. The behavioral change is the one which is the toughest. If I mean, we all know that it's very difficult, and it's only with a lot of intentionality from the organization, where they are trying to make it as a part of their culture. That's when you start seeing results. That's how it has worked for me till now.
So I'm curious though, because one of the frustrating things I face is everyone's sort of so hell-bent on immediate results and execution, right? They're so focused on execution. So has that been a challenge? Because what you're talking about, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. Behavioral change takes time and it requires long-term commitment, right?
Yeah. Maybe I'm a little fortunate that I haven't had clients who have been looking at immediacy when it comes to behavioral change. They know that it is because they understand that it's so. We are talking about, what has happened over decades that we are trying to address right now, right? When we are talking about, let us say, somebody who is plagued by self-doubt, somebody who from the time was a child, from the time who was a little girl, has been by the society as well as familial kind of stereotyping that has taken place, the person has learned to doubt themselves, second guess themselves, right? Now, this is a entire their childhood, their adulthood, they've gone through this. Now, if you're asking for a change there, they know that there are no immediate solutions there. It is going to, they have to begin the journey and they have to walk the talk for some time, and that is when they can see the results. I think I possibly have been a little lucky on that front, that my clients have been kind of quite understanding about that, and they're ready to walk that journey. That is what I've seen.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because one of the complaints, at least in the US, is, and of course DEI is now sort of a bit of a political football, but but when it was happening too, a lot of people felt it was, that there was not necessarily a long-term commitment. It was more like a checklist mentality. It's like, we need to do a few things. So chalo, to make it look good to the outside world for public relations, we'll do that. So I'm really happy to hear that there is, genuine commitment behind it, at least the people you're working with.
I think, Nikhil, I would like to add something here. What has also happened over a period of time is that there is a lot of conversation that has been happening on diversity, on equity, on inclusion. There is a lot of work that people are doing. There's a lot of publications which are talking about it. So what has also happened is that typically in organizations, when people have been pushing for ROIs, right? So they kind of have also been co-opted into this journey, and when they become part of the journey and when they realize that they need to understand what is actually the history behind this, why is this happened, I have noticed that now they slowly start kind of taming down or going down on this whole thing about what is the return on investment, how can I expect, when can I expect results. I've seen that coming down a little, because now they are part of the journey. When they were kept out of the journey, I mean, for example, let us say, traditionally, a CFO would not attend such programs, let us say. Historically, let us say the CFO would not attend such programs. Now, if a CFO attends this program and has a daughter, okay, and when they hear about the kind of inequities that women are facing in the workplace, it kind of resonates personally to them, right? When it starts resonating personally with leaders, I feel that is where the biggest change happens. That's my personal experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant insight. And I do believe that there was a judge in the US who changed his vote about, I think it was the famous abortion law, that after Rewrote, and he was, before that he was sort of against it. So
yeah,
I totally hear you about the lived
yeah,
experience, and I think also probably generationally now, right? Because younger
yeah,
generations everywhere are
yeah,
inherently more inclusive, right?
yeah,
As a cohort
yeah, yeah,
than perhaps the generations before them.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
And they're quite vocal too. They're
yes,
just expecting. I mean, it's what I have seen is that they not only expect their employer brand to be doing good, they also should be seen to be doing good, right? So they want both. They
true.
are very clear about that. I mean, they do all their ref checks before they get on board. They want to see what is the point of view the company has about, let us say, diversity, about equity, about inclusion. They do all those checks and they ask all those uncomfortable questions in the interviews. So that's a very, very positive trend there, because they are going to be the change makers. And when you look at all the reports, by about 2030, you are going to have a lot of 35 plus year olds who are going to be in positions of power. And if these
Yeah,
people are
true.
already asking those questions, it serves the society very well. Well, helps everybody.
Yeah, and the other thing that's very interesting to me is diversity has gotten a very bad name because I think it's also been sold very badly, right? In many quarters. Because it's
Yeah,
not, to me, it's also about diversity of viewpoints, right? It's not just
yeah,
about
yeah,
skin
yeah,
color and
yeah,
gender.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
also bringing different voices in the room, different
yeah,
lived
yeah,
experiences, which lead
yeah,
to better business outcomes.
yeah,
So that people don't talk
absolutely.
about enough, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think the diversity of thought has been missed out in all of this. When we are talking about, even for
Yeah,
example, when we are talking about, let us say, even in the advertising industry, the reason why it is so important to have more women, whether it is in creative or whether it is in account planning or in client servicing, is because most of the brands willy-nilly are talking to women in some way or the other, right? And if you do not have those voices in the room, whether it is to write a script or whether it is to kind of visualize something, then you have kind of somewhere lost the plot already there, right? And what comes out is kind of very caricaturish it is, right? What you see, the final results there. And the women who are watching it are wondering, is that really me? I don't think so. This is not the way I behave, or this is not the way I speak, right? And all the stereotypical ways in which the women are portrayed. For example, the woman is kind of in the kitchen, or she's not the decision maker. Financial products, for example, they talk to men. Even now they talk only to men. And there are so many women out there in the workforce. They are taking their decisions about where to invest, where to put their money in. But you have the financial products still talking to men. So these are the times when women are like, what's going on, right? And that's where we need
yeah,
representation to make sure that the work that we are delivering has to have multiple voices, thoughts, the diversity of thought that comes into the table when you have diverse people is what we are looking at. And even when we are talking in a country like ours, for example, when you're talking to a particular part of the country, or for example, you are reaching to a certain demographic in the country, let us say. I mean, we know very well that you need to have had that kind of, if you have the lived experience, the kind of the language that you bring to the work is going to be very different, right? So I
yeah.
think that's where diversity of thought has multiple nuances in it, and that's something which is getting missed out by most of the people. And they seem to be focused on gender, seem to be focused on people with disabilities, or people LGBTQ community, or people with neurodiversity. It's important that they have to be brought to the forefront, but in all of this, we should not miss out the whole conversation around what is it about the cognitive diversity that people are bringing to the table, right? I think that's I'm so glad that you brought it up, Nikhil, actually.
Yeah, and I think it's a common misconception. I love the way you put it because, and I think business is missing out on the actual,
Yeah,
the bottom
yeah,
line impact of that, right?
yeah,
Because, like
yeah,
you said,
absolutely.
especially in advertising, I think it's critical. And you just reminded me yesterday, we're doing some our bank here. We were had to get some stuff done with the local accounts that we have, and this girl had come to fill out all our forms, and then she asked about the investments and looked at me, and she's talking to my wife. She then turns around and says, so you must handle all the investments. She looks at me. So I should talk to you about that. And I was like, actually, no, she handles everything because I have zero financial acumen.
Yeah,
So it's so
yeah,
ingrained in our society, right? Even a
absolutely.
woman
Yeah,
will look at me and say, you must be managing the finances. So
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
know what you
yeah,
mean. There's still work to
yeah,
be done, but I think it's worth doing.
yeah, yeah. It
So
is.
the other thing I want to touch back on that pivot you mentioned, right? Because you had you had to pivot from a brand standpoint, from positional power, which you originally thought of building your brand on, to one built on thought leadership, right? And I'm going to come back
Yeah,
and touch on how you build thought leadership. But tell me a little bit about how that pivot actually looked like in practice. What's the first thing
yeah,
you did? What did you have to sort of undo or unlearn to
yeah,
make this positioning shift?
yeah. I think, Nikhil, for me, the first revelation was that, when it came to the advertising industry, I was known, right? People knew who I was, what work I had done, so they knew me. But when it came to my corporate clients who were from multiple industries, right? So they're all from multiple industries. I mean, they don't know me. They didn't know what is the value that I could bring to the table, right? And that's when it struck me that, possibly, maybe I did not really think about it, but my personal brand when I was for the 15 years as a CHRO was built on strategic thinking, solution providing, and to some extent the positional power that I also owned as the CHRO of the organization, right? Now, once I was
Right.
out of that, strategic thinking is something that the client sees only after they hire you and after you're actually on board. Otherwise, they don't see the strategic thinking. Your problem solving,
True.
you are really not seen as a problem solver for them really at that point of time. So therefore, and you don't have the positional power. So that is when I said, you know what, I think the time has come right now for you to kind of um, rebrand yourself, okay, or you have to create a new identity for yourself, whatever is the right way to look at it. So I said, if that is the way it is going to be, if I'm going to rebrand myself, my personal brand, what should it be anchored on? That was the first thought that came to my mind. What should it be anchored on? And when I thought about it, I said it has to be anchored on thought leadership, right? So I said, if thought leadership is the way it is going to be anchored on, then what is it that I need to do in order to be seen as a thought leader? How should people experience me at multiple touch points that, where they're going to interact with me, right? So that's the way I started looking at it. Maybe, honestly, Nikhil, all that I saw, all the people doing in the ad agency, when I used to speak to the account planners, when used to speak to the creative folks, and when I used to speak to the client servicing folks, maybe all of that information was somewhere getting stored in my head, and that kind of
Yeah.
came alive here to my rescue when I started building my own consultancy. So I think I was very clear. I wanted thought leadership to be the anchor for my personal brand. And once that became the anchor, I now started saying, how do people experience me at various points, at multiple touch points? So then I started accordingly working on addressing all those touch points. So that's the way I went about it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And you hit on something which is really critical too, is earlier, like even when I was a senior partner at Ogilvy, that title opened the door, right? And then you
Yeah,
could prove yourself.
absolutely.
But
Yeah,
without that, how do you get the door
yeah,
open? And
yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah,
And when people ask me about, I also conduct sessions on personal branding, right? So therefore, there are sometimes there are situations where people feel that at the end of the session they will walk away with a magic formula where tomorrow morning they'll have a shining new personal brand. That's when I have to tell them that it's all about consistency, it is all about perseverance, it's all about clarity. You need to be very clear what you stand for, right? You need to be very consistent in the way your brand is being experienced across the multiple touch points. Those things, and you have to be very perseverant. You can't give up, right? You have to keep doing it again and again and again, right? And you need to be, you need to decide, like, if for example, in my case, if I had to be seen as a thought leader, that meant that I had to put in a lot of effort, lot of midnight oil was burnt to write a lot of articles in the space of DEI. And I had to, very, very intentionally, with a lot of intentionality, I had to curate articles which was in the space of DEI and which was in the space of women enablement. And I have spent hours together sitting and writing them, and reaching out to publications and asking them if they are open to publish my articles. I've done all of that. And I also had some publication reaching out to me saying that, hey, Roopa, are you open to writing articles on FOSH for us, prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace for us? I said, yes, why not? Because it's going to help women. It's going to help organizations understand how to create inclusive spaces so that women can thrive at their workplace without any fear of sexual harassment. So I actually wrote 8 articles for them. So it's kind of been, when you're talking about thought leadership, it is multiple, it kind of spans across all these things. And I also another very important thing that I did, Nikhil, is that I made sure that I was actually giving a lot of knowledge without expecting anything in return, right? Because what happens is that when you're looking at growing your network, people always make the mistake of thinking growing a network is equivalent to receiving something from the network, right? Now, very often people miss out the fact that there is a lot that you can give to the network, right? And without any expectation, if you're able to give to the network, it's just going to once again further build on this thought leadership that I wanted to see people me as a thought leader, right? So that also actually helped, where I kind of was available to my networks at any given point of time, and to help them out with any kind of sticky situations that they had. I was there for them. So that's something that I did when it came to, curating my personal brand anchored on thought leadership.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that's a really valuable piece of advice for anybody listening, right? That you have to give things away of value, not things that are throwaway, but things that are actually meaningful and people will derive value from them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is how you build thought leadership, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I love how you tell people that obviously it's not something you're not going to just be a shiny object the next day. But he said it best, I think, when he said brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So even understanding that you have no control over how people are going to perceive you, or the emotional connection they can have with you is out of your control.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the other thing that I also did, I was possibly a little lucky there, because I'm a facilitator for a program called I Am Remarkable, which was started by Google, right? So now I that also resonated very well with what I wanted to do in terms of, empowering more people to have a voice, to learn to speak about their own achievements, right? Either at the workplace or outside of the workplace. So I conducted multiple I Am Remarkable workshops for corporate clients, for individual groups. I did that as well. And those programs I conduct pro bono, right? So that also kind of, and it also helped me to kind of move ahead in the tiring process, where I'm now a platinum tire facilitator for that. So, which is very, very impactful as a program. And for me, it makes my soul sing. That's what I would like to say.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about something else, which a lot of solopreneurs struggle with. It's almost like a little bit of a gut punch, right? And you mentioned to me getting that call from procurement saying your price wasn't good enough. And then there's your deck, which you described as a slice of your heart sitting there, right?
Yeah.
So take me back to one of those early calls. How did the conversation go, and how did you feel walking away from it?
Yeah. I think the early stages when I started off, and when I was told that, hey, Roopa, now you'll get a call from procurement, right? Fortunately for me, procurement as a role or as a department was not very new, mainly because I'd heard everybody in advertising cribbing about that, about the fact that the creative product is now going to be evaluated not by the marketing head of the organization, but by the procurement team. I'd heard enough and more about that. So I kind of was prepared with that. But still, despite all that preparation of what a procurement team is going to ask you, when people started talking to me about, reducing my consultancy fees, in the beginning, I was a little embarrassed. I was a little uncomfortable, and I honestly did not know how to talk to these people about the value that I'm bringing, because I was not very sure whether they really cared.
Right.
I was not very sure at that point of time, right? Then, to be fair to the process, I somewhere kind of realized that, you know what, these folks are doing their jobs, right? And if you, as a partner, if you can help do their jobs better, right, then what is going to happen is that you kind of have them on your side, and it becomes so much more easier to take this procurement process forward, instead of looking at it as a stumbling block, right? They're doing their job as from an organization point of view, and I just need to kind of empower them and to do their jobs better. Maybe the HR in me came out there at that point of time, right? So I think then I started kind of possibly creating scripts for myself where I would demystify it for them in terms of the value that I was bringing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that to a large extent has helped me right now in terms of, managing this entire thing. And I have no problems now talking to procurement. Initially, I did. I really, as I told you that day, it really, because every deck that you create, every training program that we curate, we generally give a slice of a heart to that, right? And when that is being kind of questioned, it becomes a little uncomfortable. That's what I felt. Yeah, I guess now I've reached a space where it doesn't bother me as much, because I think the moment you realize that there is a value that they are bringing to the table, and if you're able to kind of also convey to them what is the value that you bring to the table, and I think it becomes a little more easier. And also, don't look at them as your adversary. That's the other thing. If there is a shift in the mind about that, I think it kind of becomes a lot more easier, is what I would say.
Yeah, and you're right. And I actually went through the same process of sort of detaching my self-worth from my proposals, because obviously now there's no company logo that you attach the rejection to, right? It's direct. And
absolutely.
I love that you said that they're just doing their job. So even the client is evaluating on the merits of the proposal, not making a judgment on you as a human being. Right? So the other thing I want to talk about, you mentioned getting triggered while conducting workshops, right? People sharing their vulnerabilities, and suddenly something hits close to home for you. So can you take me back to a specific moment when that happened, and how you sort of got through the rest of the workshop?
Yeah, I think it's more about, the kind of work that I do, especially what happens is that it does not prepare you for the kind of emotional labor that goes in, both from the point of view of putting together the content, putting together the proposal, thinking about, how this journey should be for the organization, because it can't be the same for everybody, right? So the journey of every company is very different. So every proposal, our proposals are never cut paste. It is very, very specific to an organization, right? So there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into that. So that is one part of it. Okay. So when there is a rejection of a proposal, it's also a rejection of that emotional labor that has gone into it, right? That is the first part. The second one is when you are actually doing a workshop and there are some people who are being extremely vulnerable, right? And who speak about some of their lived experiences. And that kind of, triggers you in such a manner where it kind of suddenly transports you back to a situation where you possibly had dealt with something like that, right? So now the way I positively use this, Nikhil, is that I look at it as a teachable moment for them, right? I look at it as a moment where I can kind of use storytelling and show them how from where to where I have moved because of the various steps that I have taken in my career, right? So rather than getting triggered by that and you just kind of get paralyzed by that trigger, right? Use that as a teachable moment and use that as a storytelling opportunity for the other person so that they feel that they're not alone in this, right? So that's the way I have started using that those triggers right now.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful lens. And because we're all human, we've all had experiences, and those things stay with us. And you're right, it's very easy to feel like you put it in a shelf over here, but we don't function like that. We are holistic, right? You can't compartmentalize
Absolutely.
something. So I love the way you look at it.
Yeah.
There was something else you said that really stayed with me, right? So you're helping women overcome their inner critic and imposter syndrome. But when you asked yourself, who's helping me? That must have been sort of a lonely realization, right? So how do you deal with your own imposter moments when you're supposed to be the expert who's helping others through theirs?
Yeah. It is a very real feeling, let me tell you that. It's a very real feeling where you have to kind of, you have to do something which possibly, especially in the beginning when I started the journey, I did not have the experience of having done this myself. I used to get things done through others, but strategically I would be, do the thinking there. So those were the moments when I used to kind of really have these challenges of, am I really qualified to do this? Am I doing the right thing? There were a lot of those questions that happened. But what I did, guess what I did? The same thing that I advise my women, the women that that I kind of either mentor, coach, or I take the sessions for, I tell them, flip the script. Okay, and that's exactly what I do in my head. I flip the script and I tell myself, what if this is going to be the best ever program that you have conducted? Instead of asking yourself, what if it is going to bomb? Ask yourself, what if this is going to be a watershed moment in your entire series that you're offering to people, right? So that changes the whole situation completely, right? You don't want to lose that opportunity of creating a watershed moment for yourself as well as for the organization, right? So that's how I've learned to deal with my inner critic.
I absolutely love that, Roopa, because I mean, I'm going to steal that absolutely, because the one I've always heard is, think about what's the worst that can happen. That's the most common refrain people use, right, to deal with the inner critic. It's just the worst thing that can happen, and it's not the end of the world. But I love your reframe of it, which is like, what could, if this becomes your sort of 15 minutes, right? Yeah, I totally love that. So I want to go back and touch a little more on the articles that, the thought leadership that you built, the visibility, because you mentioned you were sort of spending many hours logging on weekends. Tell me a little bit about, so two things I want to ask you about is, how did you decide, where to show up to be visible? And also, as you were creating this content, where did you draw the line? Because the stuff you talk about, is very vulnerable and can be very private. So how did you decide how much to share, and where did you draw the line?
I think in the beginning, I decided to kind of focus on the industry that I came from, because that's the industry I really understand very well, right? So therefore, I decided to be in that space. I mean, I decided to write in that space because that's where I could kind of really let my creative juices flowing in the beginning there in terms of writing, right? And I was also possibly lucky that, a lot of these media houses, they picked up the articles that I had written, or they reached out to me and they said, Roopa, could you write something to on this particular topic? And so that's how it began, right, in the beginning. And all my writing, I have noticed, it is not about anything personal. It's about, it's about the kind of challenges that people have, And so I'm not associating myself directly to that. It's about the challenges of others. So therefore, there was no question of my vulnerability coming out there. It was more about my let us say my ability to kind of connect the dots, where I have seen a lot of things happening as disparate events, and connecting all of them together and saying that and building the story out of that and connecting to a certain industry. And later on, I knew that I don't have to connect to any specific industry. It was universal. What I was saying was universal, right? So what was very close to people's heart and which people were finding difficult to speak, for example, gender pay parity. People find it very difficult to speak about it, right? So therefore I said, let me demystify that. Let me start talking about what is it all about? What is it in the first place? Then what is it that we can do as an organization? So, and what does history have to do with the pay parity, for example? And in all of this, I did not want anybody to feel cornered. That was one thing that I remembered. I don't want somebody to look at this as a zero-sum game, where they feel that whatever Roopa is saying is all about women, and what about us? We men did not create this system. We men are not responsible for what we have inherited, right? That's a very pertinent and valid point. They have just inherited it. They did not create it. Right? So therefore, it was very important for me to also empathize with the way men were feeling about this whole thing. So which meant whatever I wrote, whatever I said in panels had to also resonate with their voices and what they felt. That drove me to also create a program called Breaking Masculine Stereotypes. So, which helps men to kind of, men also need to be given a space where they can speak about their vulnerabilities, because when we are talking about a whole lot of stuff that is happening in the corporate world when it comes to women, in all of that, my personal experience was men would walk up to me and say, Roopa, what about us? Who's talking about us? Right? So that's when I said I curated this program called Masculine Stereotypes, which talks about the kind of stereotypes that men deal with on an everyday basis, both out there in the society and even at the workplace. So it becomes kind of, they feel heard, they feel seen. That's also very important.
I love that you said that, because that's actually a really good sort of viewpoint to bring to this debate, right? Because you're right. I think in a lot of countries, it's become very one-sided, and it always feels like a zero-sum game, right? Because in America, there's a generation of young men who are feeling completely ignored, completely silenced, completely left out, and it's coming, and they're acting out in antisocial ways now, right? To your point, which is that it's not one or the other. You want to build allyships and bring everybody to a point of equality, not lift one up at the expense of pushing the other down. And I think that has gotten lost in this debate. So I love the way you framed it.
Yeah, and it's also important to kind of help men understand what allyship is all about and what allyship is not. Right? Many times what happens is that's another thing, Nikhil, which happens is that many men are made to believe that allyship is all about saving women. Women don't need saving, right? They just need somebody to walk alongside them, right? Shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, a partner.
Who is that's the way they want. You don't need to save anybody here. So what happens is that gets kind of diluted when we're talking about allyship. If in case it has been misinterpreted as saving somebody, then there is also an element of condescension that comes in. There is an element of patronizing that comes in, which is going to irk the other party, right? So therefore, we have to be very careful when we are going to be walking on all these areas, because you need to make sure that you are delivering the right message there, right? It is not one against the other. It is one for the other, right? It has to be that way. So I guess, it's a long journey that people are learning now, and I'm so glad that people are learning this and, they're moving on.
Yeah, no, but I think it's also important for people to, to bring that perspective into it, because as you
Yeah,
talk, I feel more and more like the male part has been left behind, right? It was almost like, men, you got to figure this out for yourself.
yeah,
And you're right, there's
yeah.
so many stereotypes that men carry also, not just, I mean, sort of societal baggage, if you
Yeah,
like, right?
it
That they
is.
didn't
Yeah,
create, but they've
yeah,
inherited.
yeah,
They need to
yeah,
break
yeah,
those too, but they need help
yeah,
breaking those.
yeah,
They're not going to do
yeah,
it
yeah.
automatically, right?
Absolutely. And both everybody carry their own backpacks, right?
Yes.
And that backpack is filled with a whole lot of, stereotypes that is kind of literally bogging them down. And yeah, I think it's just that it's only right that we all try to understand what is it that, what is the story that they have to tell. That's about it, and be mindful of every voice and every story. That's what is very important.
Yeah, it's about deepening our understanding of each other, right? Because our lived experience is
Yeah,
always going to be different.
yeah,
So if you come at it from only your
absolutely.
lived experience, you're not going to understand or be able to empathize with somebody else's, right? It's not
Yeah,
walking
true.
in their shoes, but at least learning and hearing and
Yeah,
listening to what they're going through and feeling.
absolutely. Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
I love that.
true.
So
Yeah,
one other thing I want to talk about is something that a lot of solopreneurs face is, you mentioned to me revenues aren't ringing in by the minute, but you're doing meaningful work, right? So how do you
yeah,
define
yeah.
success now versus when you did, versus how you did as a CHRO? How's your definition changed?
Well, I think right now, the way I look at it is that the work that I'm doing, is it making impact? Is it creating impact? For me, that is the first step. Even before I go to the revenue part of it, for me, it's about impact. The moment I'm convinced that there is impact that is created through my work, and only then after that it's going to be about the revenues. And I truly believe that when you start focusing on creating impact, revenues will follow. It has to follow. That is the way I look at it.
Yes. Yeah, no, again, I think that's a great way to look at it, and also takes a little bit of the stress off that I know every solopreneur feels, right? But it also means
Yeah,
having a plan, right? I think you
yeah,
can't just
yeah.
wing
You need
back.
to have
You
a plan.
have to,
Yeah, yeah. No, no,
yeah,
definitely not.
and
That's
give
what,
yourself a
that's
runway.
something. Yeah, yeah. That's something that I would always say to people who are starting their solopreneurship, is that the first very critical thing is you have to have discipline, right? Because when you're on your own, what happens
Yeah,
is that there's a tendency to kind of take it a little easy, and you don't have to get to work by 9:30 or 8 o'clock or whatever you've been used to. So there's a tendency to kind of start drifting, right? I think discipline becomes
that's
very
right.
important. That's very, very critical. And the second thing is, you need to have, if not a solid action plan, at least have a tentative action plan, which is in the form of, where do I want to be, let us say 6 months down the line? Where do I want to be 12 months down the line? And if I need to be there, what are the things that I should be doing right now? Right? And try to start breaking them down into some, parts, which doesn't look very daunting, but which kind of inspires you, motivates you, and that's the way it should be done. Otherwise, you're going to be all over the place. uh, if you don't have a plan, it's not going to work. I mean, even for example, Nikhil, when I spoke about, when I was rebranding, myself, even there was a plan.
Yeah,
It was very clearly a plan that, I was kind of telling myself, Rupa, you need to write at least two thought pieces in a month, right? And you are going to make sure that it gets published, two pieces, and at least three times a week you're going to post on LinkedIn. So these are the kind of things that I was telling myself, and I said, yes, I need to now start working towards it. That itself becomes a wonderful starting point, because you're doing something very different and very meaningful, and that sure enough is going to lead to some results. May not be immediate, but over a period of time it starts showing results.
yeah,
The
no, I
consistency.
completely agree with you. It's like, yeah, exactly. Consistency and the focus on that purpose, right? And that's what should
Yeah,
wake you up every
absolutely.
morning, not the
Yeah,
cash register ringing, which
yeah,
obviously is important, but
absolutely,
you need to.
absolutely.
So now,
Yeah,
if we were to meet again 3 years from now, Rupa, what would you want to have achieved?
I think 3 years from now, when I meet you, I want a lot more stories of women who will tell you that she walked through the door and she moved me from self-doubt to self-belief, and because of which it has made a huge impact on my career, and this is where I am today as a leader, right? That is what I would like more and more women to say that. And the other thing which I worked for a company which is Young and Rubicon, which used to talk about being foolish about the kind of aspirations and ambitions. You just need to have those kind of ambitions and aspirations. I also somewhere I'm kind of somewhere feel I want to evangelize this space, right?
Yeah.
Evangelization needs a lot of hard work. There are going to be a lot of areas where you're going to face a dead end. You're going to be told they don't need you. All that is going to happen. But I'm like, you know what? I will do it still, right? If I just kind of have to do it, I will do it. And if it's going to help women who are going to be entering the corporate world now and for 20 years from now or 5 years from now, if even I've made a couple of dents in such a manner that their lives are going to be so much more easier, and they can start seeing more women like them, because at the end of the day, you become what you see, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if they can see more women, they aspire to become like them, right? So maybe 3 years down the line, I would want that kind of a situation to have happened, where you see more women who feel that they can become somebody like the role models that they see around them.
Yeah, I love that, and I'm rooting for you. And I think it's absolutely important as a society for us to have that equilibrium, right? Because I think we end up in a better place in every way, economically, socially, So I'm absolutely cheering for you. So if you sort of touched on this, but I always ask my guests, if you could offer one piece of advice to someone wanting to start their solopreneur journey, what would you tell them?
I think don't give up. That's all. There's going to be a lot of situations where the self-doubt will take over, revenue pressures will take over. Have faith in your purpose, have faith in the impact that you're going to create, have faith in the work that you're going to be able to do. Just have faith in yourself, right? And don't give up. That is all that I would like to say.
That's a great message. So is there anything else you'd like to share, Roopa, with our listeners that we haven't covered?
No, I think all that I would like to say is that, when we are talking about especially solopreneurship, what happens is that we try to kind of start second guessing ourselves and wonder whether we have to be a different version of ourselves. That kind of, you have all those feelings there. I think I personally am of the opinion that the world really does not need a louder version of someone else. Okay. It just needs your very honest version out there. That's all. So just do it. That's about it. And just be it. That's all.
Yeah, that's beautiful advice. And it was Oscar Wilde who said, be yourself because everyone else is taken.
Everyone else is taken. Absolutely. Quote. Absolutely. He says that. I remember that. He said that. Yeah, that's all. It doesn't need any more versions of yourself, right? So just be yourself. That's about it. Because this is something that as a solopreneur at multiple points of time, you have that feeling that, do you have to pivot this way? Do you have to pivot that way? Do you have to be that one? Do you have to be this one? Just be yourself. That's about it.
Yes, and stay true to yourself. I think that's great advice.
Absolutely.
So that's a great way to get to our rapid fire round. So I'm going to throw 5 fun questions at you and just tell us what comes to mind.
Sure.
So, one word your best friend would use to describe you.
Dependable.
Dependable. Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
If you could have an outdoor billboard or hoarding, as we used to say in India, I remember, with any message for women in corporate who are thinking about going solo, what would it say?
Just do it.
That I think you might have a lawsuit on your hands, but I love it.
Yeah.
What's something you believed at 40 that you no longer believe at 50 plus?
Will I be able to do it? Am I capable? Will I make a fool of myself?
You've shared all
I
of
don't
that.
believe in that. Yeah.
I don't either. And it took me till my 50s to learn that.
Yeah.
Complete this sentence. The thing nobody tells you about being a solopreneur is dash.
The freedom is a responsibility in solopreneurship.
Very true, and a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
What's one belief about success you hope the next generation of women never inherits from ours?
Trying to be somebody else. Trying to trying to prove something to somebody else and not to yourself.
I love that. Well, that's a great way to end our show, Roopa. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with such raw honesty, and for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it, and I'm sure a lot of people here listening will.
It was my absolute pleasure, Nikhil, to be here and to be talking to you. And a lot of your questions actually made me think a lot. And it was fun doing this.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
What stands out most in Roopa's story is how it exposes the hard truth about transitioning from corporate leader to solopreneur. Your most powerful asset was never your title. It's the expertise and perspective you've built underneath it. Here's the thing. Most people don't figure this out until after they leave, when the phone stops ringing and the invitations dry up. If your phone stops ringing the moment you leave your job, it's a huge moment of clarity. The market valued your position, not your person. That's exactly why building your personal brand before you need it is so critical. Roopa completely repositioned hers by anchoring on thought leadership, demonstrating expertise publicly before someone hires you. It's proof of your strategic thinking that clients can sample before they ever sign a contract, and sampling is what creates demand. This is how you open the door when the job title no longer does. Building on that, she shares an insight most solopreneurs desperately need to hear. Purpose drives revenue, but only if you give it the time to compound into authority. When Roopa said, I focus on creating impact first and then revenues follow, that wasn't idealism, that was strategy. Leading with purpose attracts clients who value transformation, not transactions, people who invest, not negotiate. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Transformation takes time. Roopa's work is about behavioral change, and you can't undo decades of conditioning on a quarterly timeline. If you're building a purpose-led business, patience isn't a weakness, it's part of the model. Another moment that really resonated with me and will resonate with any solopreneur is how she reframed dealing with procurement. Instead of seeing them as adversaries trying to commoditize her work, she recognized that they were just doing their job. And if she could help them do their job better, they'd become allies. This is a master class in stakeholder management and a reminder that emotional detachment is a business skill, not a personality trait. Your proposal is not a reflection of your worth as a human being. It's a business document being evaluated by someone with different constraints and priorities. Once you internalize that, rejection stops feeling personal and becomes data, insight into how the market makes decisions. Finally, her advice about not giving up and staying true to yourself. That's not just motivational fluff, it's brand strategy. Because here's what nobody tells you. Building a solo business is an endurance sport, not a sprint. And most people quit at mile 3. You're going to have months where the revenue doesn't match the effort. You're going to question if you made the right choice. The solopreneurs who make it aren't the most talented. They're the ones who stay consistent long after the excitement wears off. The ones who protect the energy, like Roopa talks about protecting impact over immediate revenue, and those who refuse to contort themselves into someone else's version of success. That consistency builds brand equity. That authenticity creates differentiation, and that patience compounds into revenue. So here's your action step this week. Ask yourself one hard question. What is your brand actually built on? Not your resume, not your past titles, not borrowed credibility from companies you used to work for. If you can't point to consistent public demonstrations of your expertise that potential clients can experience before they hire you, you don't have a solopreneur brand, you have a profile. Start this week. Pick one platform, commit to one high value output every week, and give it at least 6 months to compound before you decide whether it's working. Authority isn't built by one viral post. It's built by 52 weeks of showing up when nobody's watching. Next week, we close this series with Teesta Sen, my dear friend, and the woman who introduced me to Indrila, Monisha, and Roopa. Teesta went from ad agency powerhouse to solo creative force, and what she learned along the way will challenge everything you think about going solo. She'll tell you why your voice doesn't magically return when you leave corporate, why you have to consciously reclaim it, why thinking alone is the most underrated skill in solo business, and why women especially need to stop writing themselves off before the world does. If you've been on the fence about going solo, Teesta is going to give you permission you've been waiting for and the reality check you actually need. Don't miss the finale. Thanks for listening to Unfiltered Solopreneur. If this episode made you realize your brand story isn't as sharp or compelling as it could be, book a free brand clarity session with me. In 30 minutes, I'll help you pinpoint the gaps and show you 2 moves to stand out and attract better clients. Book yours at clarity.boostsolo.com or through the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep breaking free from the corporate grind, and remember, your story is your most powerful asset. Live solo or die corporate.